If Hormuz and Bab el Mandeb go dark, what happens if the world's two most important sea gates start failing at the same time? Not a movie, not a conspiracy. This is real-world pressure building on the global system right now. Because if the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el Mandeb both start going unstable, the world doesn't just get nervous. It gets expensive, slower, and a whole lot more chaotic. Think of global trade like a giant delivery app. Every country is ordering goods, energy, and materials every day. Now imagine two of the app's most critical shortcuts suddenly get blocked. Yeah, everything starts charging surge pricing. Let's break it down simply. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important energy gateways on Earth, where a huge share of global oil and gas passes through. Bab el Mandeb, on the other hand, is the gate between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. It's the key access point for ships heading to the Suez Canal, one of the fastest trade routes between Asia and Europe. These aren't just random places on a map. These are the world's energy nerve and shipping nerve. And if both get squeezed at the same time, you don't get a small problem. You get a global bill that everyone has to pay. Here's where it gets serious. If just one of these choke points gets tense, markets already start reacting. If Hormuz is disrupted, oil and gas markets panic because a massive chunk of global supply is at risk. If Bab el Mandeb gets disrupted, shipping becomes slower, riskier, and more expensive, affecting tankers, cargo ships, and supply chains worldwide. But if both are under pressure at the same time, you're stacking problems on top of each other. Energy disruption, shipping disruption, insurance costs going up, and inflation all hitting at once. That's when things stop being regional and start becoming global. And this is where it hits different countries in different ways. Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Iraq sit right at the center of this. Their economies depend heavily on exporting oil and LNG. And while higher oil prices might sound good in the short term, there's a big catch. If shipping routes become unsafe or unstable, it becomes harder to move that oil reliably. That means higher security costs, uncertain exports, and weaker long-term investor confidence. In simple terms, making more money per barrel doesn't help much if the system moving that barrel becomes risky. Now look at Europe. Europe depends heavily on imported energy and goods. If Bab el Mandeb becomes unstable, ships may have to avoid the Red Sea and go around Africa instead. That adds days, even weeks, to shipping times, burns more fuel, and raises costs across the board. The result? Higher energy bills, more expensive goods, pressure on industries, and rising inflation. In other words, when shipping gets messy, Europe doesn't just get delays, it gets economic stress. India is another key player here. India relies on imports for oil, LNG, fertilizers, edible oils, and manufactured goods. If Hormuz gets disrupted, import costs rise. If Bab el Mandeb is also affected, shipping costs climb even higher. That leads to inflation pressure, trade imbalances, and stress on industries that depend on imported inputs. India may not be the center of the crisis, but it definitely feels the impact quickly. Then there's China, which is all about supply chain stability. China imports massive amounts of oil, LNG, and raw materials, and relies on smooth global logistics. If these routes become unstable, China typically responds by stockpiling, diversifying supply routes, and strengthening energy security. Because uncertainty in shipping isn't just inconvenient, it disrupts manufacturing, exports, and long-term economic planning. Japan and South Korea are highly energy dependent as well. They rely on imports for most of their oil and LNG. If these routes get disrupted, they face higher energy costs and potential supply risks. That's why they move fast, building reserves, locking in long-term contracts, and securing alternative sources. For them, energy disruption isn't a debate, it's an alarm bell. Southeast Asia also gets hit through logistics. Countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam rely on efficient shipping networks. If ships reroute around Africa, freight costs go up, delivery times increase, and goods become more expensive. Singapore especially keeps a close eye on this, because when global shipping gets tense, it feels it immediately. Africa plays a more complex role. Some regions, especially along the East Coast and Red Sea, are directly affected by instability. Other parts of Africa could see increased shipping traffic as vessels reroute around the continent, which may benefit some ports. But overall, longer routes still mean higher costs and more strain on trade. The United States, while more energy independent than before, is not immune. If global oil prices rise, it still impacts gas prices, transportation, inflation, and overall market volatility. And beyond that, the U.S. has a strategic interest in keeping these trade routes open because global stability directly ties into its economy and alliances. Now here's the part most people don't think about. What actually becomes more valuable in a crisis like this? It's not just oil. It's LNG, refined fuels, shipping capacity, insurance, war risk freight, strategic reserves, food commodities, and fertilizers. But the biggest shift is this. What becomes most valuable is not just the goods, but the ability to move them safely. That's why logistics, freight, and insurance suddenly become frontline industries. And here's the kicker. Markets don't wait for a full shutdown. Even the threat of disruption is enough to move prices. You already start seeing higher shipping rates, rising insurance costs, rerouted ships, delays, and oil price spikes. The market price is in fear early, so by the time something actually breaks, the damage is already partially done. If things escalate further, here's what could happen. In the short term, oil prices spike, shipping costs rise, insurance gets more expensive, and markets become highly volatile. In the medium term, inflation increases in countries that rely on imports, trade routes become less efficient, and companies start building backup systems. In the long term, the world shifts toward resilience, alternative routes, more reserves, and less dependence on just a few narrow choke points. Trade doesn't stop, but it gets slower and more expensive. And that's the real danger here. The global economy is built on movement. Oil has to move, goods have to move, ships have to move. But when two of the most important sea lanes in the world start breaking down, movement turns into hesitation. So the next time you hear about Hormuz or Bab el Mandeb, don't think of them as just places on a map. Think of them as pressure points in the global system. Because when those pressure points get squeezed at the same time, the entire world feels it.